Some mysteries vanish not into darkness, but into the roar of a passing train. This tale begins with a government courier who steps aboard at Charing Cross and never reaches Dover, leaving only a locked compartment and whispers of espionage. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The hour is late, the clues are faint, and Holmes has already taken his place upon the trail. Let us follow where it leads. It was upon a chill evening in early spring that I found myself once more in the familiar comfort of our sitting room at Baker Street. The lamps had been lit, and the glow of the fire cast a steady warmth against the encroaching mist that pressed at the window panes. London, muffled in its habitual cloak of smoke and drizzle, seemed a world apart from that small island of tranquility. Holmes sat opposite, his lean figure drawn against the chairback with that curious stillness which so often gave the impression of a man at rest, though I knew every nerve of him to be alert. For my part, I had taken refuge in a volume of medical essays, though my mind wandered as often as it dwelt upon the text. There was a peculiar serenity about the room that night, the crackle of the fire, the faint clink of glass as Holmes shifted his instruments on the side table, and the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. Little did I suspect that within the hour this calm would be pierced by a summons which should draw us into one of those strange and perilous adventures that seemed destined to pursue my friend wherever he turned. My gaze, straying from the printed page, lingered upon Holmes. He was bent over a small retort, from which a fine vapour ascended in lazy spirals. His hands, long and delicate, manipulated a series of stoppered files with the precision of a surgeon, yet his expression betrayed neither haste nor effort. It was the face of a thinker in repose, eyes half-hooded, lips compressed into a line of abstraction, as though the body acted merely as an instrument for the brain. I had long ceased to marvel at the variety of his pursuits, but I confess that evening held in it something almost uncanny. There was no sound from him save the faint drip of a liquid and the occasional scrape of glass against glass. He might have been an alchemist in some medieval chamber, brooding over the secret of transmutation. The light, falling obliquely upon his features, lent them a sharpness that seemed less of flesh than of carved stone. Yet behind that mask, I knew, was the ever-working mind, weaving threads invisible to the rest of us, and waiting only for some chance spark to ignite them into action. It was in the midst of this silence that a sudden rap upon the door caused me to start. Holmes, whose senses missed nothing, did not so much as lift his head, but I, laying aside my book, glanced inquiringly towards him. A second knock, more insistent than the first, followed almost immediately. "Enter," Holmes murmured, without removing his eyes from the retort. The door opened to admit Mrs. Hudson, her countenance wearing that air of mingled curiosity and unease which I had come to recognize as the herald of some untimely intrusion. "A messenger for you, sir," she announced, her voice subdued. "He insists that the matter is urgent." At this hour of the night, when the respectable citizens of London were long since indoors, such an interruption could mean little save misfortune. I rose quickly, while Holmes, with one swift movement, extinguished the flame beneath his apparatus and leaned back with an expression of resigned expectation. A boy of perhaps 12 years was shown into the room, his cap clutched nervously in his hands. His cheeks were ruddy with the cold, and his eyes darted from Holmes to myself with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Telegram for Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he stammered, extending the envelope towards me rather than the great detective. Holmes made no move to accept it, but his keen glance flicked towards me as if to signify that I should act the intermediary. I relieved the boy of his burden and pressed a coin into his palm, which he pocketed with a quick nod of thanks before retreating in visible relief. Mrs. Hudson closed the door upon him, leaving once again the quiet crackle of the fire and the muted rustle of the telegram in my hands. I turned to Holmes, who stretched out one languid arm and without a word broke the seal with the ease of a man accustomed to messages of import. Holmes unfolded the slip of paper, his eyes travelling swiftly over the lines. A scarcely perceptible tightening of his features was the sole indication of their gravity. Without a word, he handed it to me, The message, curt and official in its phrasing, ran as follows. Courier Pemberton missing. Vanished between Charing Cross and Dover. Matter of utmost consequence. Present yourself with haste at Scotland Yard. Lestrade. I read the words twice over before their full import struck me. A government courier, one entrusted with the passage of secret dispatches, disappeared upon the very line that linked our capital with the continent. What peril might not lie behind so bald a statement? Grave indeed, I murmured. Holmes leaned forward, his hands steepled beneath his chin. Grave enough to rouse even our practical friend Lestrade into uncharacteristic urgency, said he. A courier vanishes, and with him, doubtless, the papers that were his charge. It is not robbery, Watson. It is intrigue, and intrigue upon the highest stage. I confess the words sent a chill through me, for the shadow of Europe seemed to fall suddenly across our quiet room. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, where he stood with the telegram still in his hand. The mist pressed close against the panes, obscuring the street lamps into blurred halos of light. Europe moves upon a chessboard unseen by the crowd, he remarked in a tone half to himself, half to me. A pawn removed in silence may alter the fate of kings. Our courier is no more than such a piece. Yet what gambit may be concealed behind his disappearance? I shivered involuntarily. To me, Alfred Pemberton was but a name on a slip of paper. To Holmes, he was already a cipher in a larger design. There was no excitement in his words, only the cold, precise perception of a strategist surveying the field. I fear, I ventured, that the loss of those dispatches may bode calamity for us all. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. Calamity, Watson, is the spur of destiny, and destiny seldom gives warning. Holmes spoke no further, but with a suddenness that startled me, he seized his coat from the stand and thrust his arms into its sleeves. His hat followed, then his walking stick. There is no time for conjecture, he said briskly. We must to Scotland Yard at once. But the hour, I began. The hour is irrelevant, he cut in. An hour lost may be a kingdom compromised. Come, Watson. I needed no further urging. Snatching my own coat, I followed him down the stairs. Mrs. Hudson, peering anxiously from the doorway, looked as though she would have spoken, but Holmes swept past her with that air of inevitable purpose which silenced all questions. The night air struck cold as we emerged into Baker Street, the fog curling in wreaths about the lamps. A cab was hailed, and within moments we were rattling towards Scotland Yard, the telegram still burning in my pocket like the opening move of some vast and perilous game. The cab bore us swiftly through the deserted streets, its wheels clattering upon the uneven stones, until we drew up before the sombre edifice of Scotland Yard. A chill mist clung to the lamps, casting uncertain halos about them, and lending the whole district an aspect of weary vigilance. Within, the building breathed the atmosphere of long corridors and whispered confidences, where the very walls seemed to absorb the anxieties of the capital. We were received without delay and conducted through passages dimly lit by flickering gas. Our escort, a constable whose face betrayed neither curiosity nor warmth, ushered us at last to a narrow chamber, the familiar office of Inspector Lestrade. I had often noted the contrast between the bustle of the yard outside and the peculiar gravity which reigned within these walls. Yet never, I think, did the air appear so heavy with import as upon that night, when we were summoned to hear of a disappearance that might well shake the foundations of the state itself. Lestrade rose from behind his desk as we entered, his countenance more deeply lined than I had ever observed it. He was a man seldom given to displays of emotion, save an occasional touch of professional irritation. But now there was about him an unmistakable gravity that impressed me at once with the seriousness of the affair. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said he, extending his hand with uncharacteristic formality. "I am glad you could come so promptly. The yard has seldom been more pressed than at this hour, and I confess the business upon which we are engaged is one I would entrust to no other." Holmes inclined his head with the slightest of bows. You speak, then, of a matter where silence is as essential as skill, he observed quietly. Lestrade's lips tightened. You will judge for yourself, Mr. Holmes, when you hear the particulars. Alfred Pemberton, Lestrade began, a trusted courier in the service of the Foreign Office, left Charing Cross yesterday evening by the Dover Express. His orders were to deliver dispatches into the hands of an attaché bound for Calais. The train reached Dover at its appointed hour, but Pemberton did not alight. Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes fixed intently upon the inspector. His luggage, he asked. It was found in the van, said Lestrade. But of the man himself no trace. He was seen entering a compartment alone. The guard testifies that the door was locked from within at the first station. By the time they reached Dover, the door was still fastened, but Pemberton was gone. I could not restrain an exclamation of astonishment. A man vanished from a sealed carriage. Vanished, repeated Lestrade grimly, and with him papers whose loss may imperil more than his own honour. That is why I sent for you, Mr. Holmes. Lestrade produced a slip of notes from his pocket and continued with methodical precision. The compartment bore signs of struggle. A valise lay overturned upon the floor, its contents scattered. The cushions were displaced, and one strap of the seat torn as if by sudden force. Yet there was no trace of blood, nor any weapon left behind. A button was discovered, but it matches neither the courier's attire nor the railway staff. Holmes's long fingers tapped gently upon the arm of his chair, while his gaze drifted into that far-off region of thought where so many mysteries resolved themselves in his mind. A vanished passenger, a disturbed compartment, and an alien button, he murmured. It is an equation which promises solution, Lestrade, though the unknown factors may lie deep beneath the surface. The inspector glanced uneasily at him, as though reluctant to admit how baffled the official inquiry had already become. It must be plainly stated, Lestrade continued after a pause, that Pemberton was entrusted with papers of the highest importance. Their exact nature I am not at liberty to disclose, but it is enough to say that they concerned negotiations whose failure might well inflame the whole continent. If those papers are in foreign hands, the consequences are beyond calculation. Then you suspect espionage? I asked. What else, Dr. Watson? Robbery would not suffice to explain the disappearance. Pemberton was a man of spotless character, yet he had lately expressed uneasiness, as though he feared pursuit. Holmes raised his brows slightly. You perceive, Watson, said he, that we are not engaged upon the solution of a common crime. We are dealing here with that most perilous of intrigues, the hidden hand of the foreign agent. A single misstep may rouse storms that the might of armies could not quell. Holmes bent forward with that gentle courtesy which never failed to disarm the most reticent of witnesses. The guard who last saw Pemberton, what were his exact words? Lestrade consulted his notes. He said the courier entered the compartment at Charing Cross, closed the door, and drew the curtains. At the next station, the door was still fastened, but Pemberton did not appear at the window. And the porter at Dover. He declared the compartment was locked when the train drew up. They forced the door, expecting to rouse a sleeping passenger, but found only the disorder I described. Holmes inclined his head. And the lock itself? Intact. And the windows? One was slightly lowered. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A most instructive point. You have not as yet examined the ledges for marks of passage. We have done so, and found nothing conclusive. Holmes sank back in his chair. Conclusive? No. Suggestive? Most assuredly. Pray, continue. When Lestrade had finished his recital, a silence fell upon the little room. Holmes sat motionless, his chin upon his hand, his gaze fixed upon the grey swirl of smoke that rose from the lamp. I had learned to recognize that attitude as the prelude to some sudden and decisive action. At length he rose abruptly. The facts are sufficient for the present, said he. We gain nothing by further words until we have seen the carriage with our own eyes. Lestrade looked relieved. The train stands even now in the yard at Charing Cross. I shall have a carriage ready within the quarter hour. Holmes nodded. We shall accompany you. Come, Watson." And thus it was, with little ceremony, that we left the office and descended once more into the mist-laden night, the riddle of the vanished courier already shaping itself in my companion's mind, though as yet the rest of us were left to grope in darkness. The cab bore us swiftly eastward, its wheels splashing upon the damp stones as we passed through streets shrouded in a thick London mist. The lamps glowed dimly in their halos of vapour, and the outlines of buildings loomed like spectral forms against the darkness. Holmes, seated opposite me, spoke not a word. His sharp profile, lit by the occasional flicker of passing light, was as immovable as if carved from marble. I had long since ceased to trouble him with questions when he wore that air of concentrated absorption. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the cab window, yet I knew that he saw nothing of the street beyond. He was deep within that inner chamber of thought where every trifling fact found its allotted place. I confess the strangeness of the affair weighed upon me. To vanish between stations, locked within a carriage, such a riddle seemed to defy reason. And yet, in the presence of my companion, I felt that the solution, however dark, was already taking shape. We found the station quiet at that late hour, its long platforms echoing with the distant clang of metal. A solitary guard awaited us, his lantern casting wavering shadows upon the damp flags. He touched his cap nervously as we approached, and I observed in his manner a mixture of curiosity and dread, as though the mystery of the vanished courier still hung about the very air. "This way, gentlemen," said he, his voice lowered though there was none within earshot. "The compartment has been kept locked, as per the inspector's orders." He led us down a deserted siding where the carriage stood apart from the rest of the train, its dark windows like sightless eyes. The faint creak of wood and the distant wash of the tide lent to the scene a singular melancholy. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You have done well," said he. "Leave us the key, and we shall trouble you no further, unless I find I must." The door yielded with a rusty protest, and we stepped into the narrow compartment. The air within was close and stale, as though it had been long shut against the night. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his keen gaze sweeping the chamber with the cool detachment of a surgeon surveying a patient. The disorder was evident. A valise overturned, its garments strewn across the floor, cushions pressed awry, and the strap of one seat dangling in broken threads. Yet what struck me most was the silence, as though the violence that had passed here had left behind not sound, but an oppressive void. Holmes bent low, his long fingers brushing lightly across the floorboards and upholstery. He neither spoke nor gestured, but I could sense the workings of his mind in the measured stillness of his movements. I had seen him thus before, poised upon the threshold of discovery, when every mote of dust became a signpost to truth. It was Holmes who first perceived the small gleam beneath the seat. With a sudden stoop, he retrieved it and held it to the lantern light. "A button," said I, peering over his shoulder. "More than a button, Watson," he replied, turning it delicately between his fingers. "Observe the metal, brass, burnished, with the faintest trace of insignia. It is of military origin, though not British. Certainly not from Mr. Pemberton's official coat, nor from the livery of the railway staff. We have, therefore, an intruder." The conclusion, so calmly delivered, struck me with force. I reflected how easily the trifle might have escaped notice, and how quickly Holmes seized upon its significance. He slipped it into his pocket with the quiet finality of one who has secured a vital clue. "A fragment of the larger design," he murmured. "One must never despise a clue merely for its size. In the smallest article may lie the key to the grandest conspiracy." Holmes crossed to the window, which stood slightly lowered. He touched the ledge with the tip of his finger and then examined it in the lamplight. A faint white crust clung there. He rubbed it thoughtfully and then held it to his lips. "Sea salt," said he, with that quiet triumph I had come to know. "Sea salt?" I repeated, astonished. "But what should the sea have to do with this carriage, far inland?" Holmes smiled faintly. That, Watson, is the very question. Sea salt upon the window ledge of a train bound for Dover suggests a hand fresh from the tide. Our phantom visitor has not confined his movements to dry land. I shook my head in perplexity, for the implication seemed to me obscure in the extreme. But Holmes's eyes gleamed with suppressed animation, as though the trifling deposit had opened to him vistas of connection still hidden from me. "Every trace, my dear fellow," he said, "is a footprint, if one knows how to read it." Holmes's attention next alighted upon the corner seat, where his fingers traced the fabric with the delicacy of a connoisseur. He beckoned me closer, and I perceived a curious scuff, half tear and half abrasion, upon the dark upholstery. "You see it?" he asked. "It might be the mark of a boot," said I hesitantly. "Precisely. A rough sole, pressed with violence, as if some weight had been thrown upon it. Note, too, the direction of the tear. It runs upward, as though the pressure came from beneath. Imagine, then, a struggle here, one man pressed down while another sought to restrain or overpower him. This scuff is the scar of that encounter." I felt a chill run through me at the thought of that silent conflict fought within these narrow walls, while the train thundered on unheeding. Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed. A scuff, a button, a trace of salt, separate trifles, Watson, yet together they whisper of an unseen hand at work. For several minutes, Holmes paced the narrow compartment, his long fingers clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed upon the ground. I did not disturb him, for I knew well that this silence was more fruitful than any speech. His brows were knitted, and his lips moved almost imperceptibly, as though he rehearsed within himself the sequence of events. At last he paused and looked towards me. "You perceive, Watson, that this is not the work of chance. Our courier did not vanish of his own accord, nor did accident remove him. These marks speak of intrusion, silent, deliberate, and planned with consummate care." I assented, though my mind was far from grasping the whole. The air of the compartment seemed suddenly oppressive, as though the walls themselves retained the memory of violence. Holmes resumed his pacing, each step measured, until he halted abruptly and turned his gaze upon the window once more. Holmes laid his hand upon the sill, where the faint salt still glittered in the lantern's glow. His voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate. "There is more here than disappearance," said he. "We stand at the edge not of a mere crime, but of a design whose threads may stretch beyond this island. Consider, Watson, a courier entrusted with secret dispatches, a sealed carriage broken by no obvious force, and clues that breathe of foreign hands. It is not an English crime." A foreboding seized me at his words. In my mind's eye, I saw dark figures moving in silence across the channel, and the fragile peace of Europe trembling at their touch. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes glittering with cold fire. "The hour is late, but our task has only begun. Come, we must see what the night and the morrow may yield." And with that quiet pronouncement, I felt the true gravity of the adventure descend upon us both. It was upon the following morning that Holmes directed our steps towards a modest residence in one of the quieter streets south of the river. The cab set us down before a row of small, respectable houses, each with its narrow strip of garden hemmed in by railings. The blinds of one dwelling were closely drawn, and an air of silence lay upon it, as though grief had pressed heavily upon its walls. Holmes mounted the step with that firm composure which so often lent courage to those overcome by emotion. I confess I felt a certain hesitation, for it seemed almost cruel to intrude upon a woman so lately bereft. Yet Holmes's conviction that we might gain some light from Miss Clara Denham compelled me to follow. A maidservant, pale and red-eyed, admitted us with little ceremony and conducted us into a small parlour, where the heavy curtains and scent of withering flowers spoke eloquently of sorrow. There we waited in solemn silence for the lady to appear. When Miss Denham entered, I was struck by the singular union of fragility and quiet resolve in her appearance. She was young, scarcely more than 25, and though her features bore the traces of recent tears, There lingered about her an expression of dignity which no grief could wholly efface. Her hands trembled as she acknowledged us, and her lips faltered in their greeting, yet she stood before us with a composure that moved me profoundly. Holmes bowed gravely, his voice low and courteous. "We intrude upon your sorrow, madam, only because the truth must be sought while it may still be found. If you can assist us in any particular, you will be serving not only justice, but perhaps your country." At this, she inclined her head, and with a gesture invited us to be seated. I observed her eyes rest briefly upon Holmes, as though instinctively recognizing in him a man to whom truth could safely be entrusted. It was some moments before she could speak, and when at last her voice came, it trembled between anger and despair. "You speak of justice, sir," said she. "Yet what justice can there be when Alfred, my Alfred, is lost to me? I know well enough that he carried not only the burden of his office, but also some secret fear which he would not disclose. I pressed him, but he would only smile, saying that his duty forbade him to speak. And now he is gone." Her slender hands were clenched tightly upon the arm of her chair, and her eyes shone with unshed tears. Was it merely the state that claimed him, or was there some darker hand at work? I cannot rid myself of the thought that he feared something beyond his mission, some enemy, not of government, but of flesh and blood. If he is dead, then secrecy has been the cruelest of tyrants. Holmes regarded her with a gravity that matched her own. At length Miss Denham's agitation subsided, and she continued in a more subdued tone. "There is one thing I must tell you, though it may be but fancy. Some weeks past, Alfred spoke of a man who had followed him more than once through the streets. He would not name him, but he described him as tall, dark, and with eyes unlike those of any Englishman. He said that when their gazes met, he felt a chill as though he had looked upon some relentless adversary." She shuddered as she spoke, and her voice dropped to a whisper. Alfred confessed that those eyes haunted him, even in his dreams. He said they were foreign eyes, piercing, calculating, never at rest. I begged him to tell the authorities, but he laughed and said it would only make matters worse. I thought him overwrought. Now I know it was no idle fancy. Holmes, who had listened intently, inclined his head slightly. I could see that the description had awakened in him a memory or a suspicion, though he gave no word of it. Miss Denham rose and crossed to a small escritoire. Unlocking a drawer, she withdrew a folded sheet, which she held for a moment in hesitation before placing it in Holmes's hands. "It is but a fragment," she said, her voice faltering. "He gave it to me 3 days before he left. He bade me keep it safe, but said I must not read it unless misfortune befell him. I could not bring myself to open it until this morning." Holmes spread the paper upon his knee. The writing was hurried, as though penned in some moment of disturbance. Its brief lines warned of a storm that gathers unseen, and spoke of forces too great for one man's strength. There was no signature, only the initials, AP, scrawled at the bottom. "It is the hand of a man oppressed by a burden," said Holmes gravely. A letter half confessed, as though he dared not trust even his beloved with the whole truth. Holmes leaned forward, his manner softened by a courtesy I had seldom witnessed, save in the presence of sorrow. "Miss Denham," said he, "it is of the utmost importance that you recall with precision anything unusual in Mr. Pemberton's conduct of late. Any absence unexplained, any encounter that left him perturbed." She considered carefully before replying. "He was often late in returning, more so these last few weeks. Once I thought I heard him mention Dover when he believed me not to hear. He grew restless, starting at sudden sounds, and more than once he warned me not to walk alone in the evenings. I asked him if he suspected danger, but he would only press my hand and change the subject." Holmes nodded gravely. Such reticence often springs not from mistrust, but from a desperate wish to protect. Yet secrecy is a double-edged weapon. It shields for a time, but it also isolates. His voice was so gentle that Miss Denham's eyes filled afresh with tears. As I listened, my heart was moved with pity for the young woman before us. To be bound in love to one who must walk daily upon the edge of peril is a sacrifice few can comprehend. It is not only the man who bears the weight of duty. Those who wait in silence bear a heavier burden still. I could not but reflect how often I myself had seen Holmes risk his life in the pursuit of truth, and how many there must be who loved such men and suffered in secret. The state which demands their service counts little the tears of women, yet it is upon such unseen sacrifices that nations are upheld. Miss Denham sat quietly now, her hands folded in her lap, her courage asserting itself once more. Holmes's keen gaze softened as he regarded her, though his mind was already turning from pity to deduction. When at last we rose to depart, Miss Denham thanked us with a composure that touched me deeply. Holmes bowed with grave courtesy and assured her that no effort would be spared to discover the truth. As we descended the narrow stair, I turned to my companion. His face wore that expression of inward concentration, which I had come to recognize as the prelude to discovery. "You are convinced?" I asked. "I am convinced," he replied, "that we face not merely the hand of espionage, but the darker shadow of betrayal. It is one thing to be pursued by foreign agents. It is another to be undermined by those who claim kinship or friendship." His words struck coldly upon my heart, for they hinted at treachery more intimate than I had dared imagine. And as we stepped once more into the bleak London air, I felt that the mystery had deepened rather than cleared. The following day found us journeying southward, the train bearing us swiftly through a landscape of chalk hills and fields, grey beneath a sullen sky. As we drew near to Dover, the sharp tang of salt crept into the air, mingling with the smoke of the engine. The harbour town lay before us, stark and windswept, its clustered roofs pressed close against the sea as though for shelter. I have seldom known a place that seemed to hold so much of vigilance and expectancy. The cries of gulls circled above the masts, and the boom of the waves against the piers reached us even inland. Holmes, seated opposite, gazed out with a gaze that betrayed no emotion, though I knew his mind to be busily at work upon the riddle before us. When at last we descended upon the platform, it was clear that the shadow of the missing courier had already fallen upon Dover, for the officials moved with an air of strained unease. Holmes lost no time in seeking out the railway staff. A porter, summoned at Lestrade's direction, stood before us twisting his cap in his hands, his eyes darting about as though fearful of being overheard. "I remember him well, sir," said he, "the gentleman with the official bag. He stepped down at Dover, though not alone. There was another with him, a tall man, foreign-looking, who walked close at his side. They passed me quickly, speaking low, and before I could think, they were gone into the crowd." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You are certain he alighted of his own will?" "Yes, sir. No struggle. But he looked pale, as if troubled. The other seemed to guide him, almost like a nurse might a patient." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Your memory does you credit. It is often the small man's observation that upsets the plans of the great." The porter flushed with pride, though his hands continued to tremble. "Describe him," Holmes demanded, his tone calm but penetrating. The porter frowned in thought. "Tall, sir, with broad shoulders. His coat was of foreign cut, dark, but with a collar higher than what English gentlemen wear. He had a beard trimmed close, and his hat sat low upon his brow. Yet what struck me most was his manner, confident, as though the platform belonged to him, though I had never seen his face before." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, though his own features betrayed nothing. "Did they speak?" he asked. "Softly, sir. I could not catch the words, only that the foreigner seemed to lead, and the gentleman followed." Holmes tapped his cane lightly against the ground, as if some inner chord had been struck. "Very good. That will serve." The porter withdrew, leaving behind an impression of unease that lingered with me long after he had gone. From the station we made our way towards the harbour, where Holmes soon engaged another witness, a dockside labourer His broad frame stooped from toil, his face weathered by the sea air. I saw them," said the man in response to Holmes's inquiry. "Two gentlemen passed close by as I carried my load. One of them spoke a name, low, but I caught it clear as day, Rochefort." "Rochefort," Holmes repeated softly. The man nodded. It meant nothing to me, but the way it was said, it had the sound of recognition, like a password between comrades. Holmes inclined his head gravely and pressed a coin into the man's hand. I observed in my companion that curious stillness which always accompanied the arrival of a clue of the first importance. He neither questioned further nor betrayed surprise, but I knew by the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth that the name had struck deep into his knowledge. We walked a little way in silence, Holmes moving with long strides, his head bowed as though in study. I ventured to remark upon the coincidence of the name. "It is no coincidence, Watson," said he at length. His tone was cool, yet his lips were compressed in a line of resolution. "When a name such as this drifts from the mouths of unknown men in a harbour town, it is as though one heard the whisper of a cannon before the shot." I pressed him to explain, but he merely shook his head. "Patience, my dear fellow. The chain must be complete before the weight can be measured. Until then, speculation is waste." I could not but notice, however, the rare intensity of his gaze as he surveyed the shipping and the crowded quays. It was clear to me that, though outwardly unmoved, some inward spark had been kindled by that single whispered word. At length Holmes turned to me, his voice lowered, though none stood near. "You have heard of Rochefort, Watson?" I confessed my ignorance. "Then you may count yourself fortunate," he said. "Rochefort is not a name to be spoken lightly. He is a Frenchman, once in military service, now more dangerous than any soldier. In the secret councils of Europe his name appears like the shadow of a hand upon the wall. He is a master of intrigue, a weaver of webs too fine for the common mind to trace. Where he walks, disappearances follow, and where his eyes rest, loyalty is soon divided." The gravity of his tone struck me deeply. "And you believe that Pemberton has fallen into his power?" "I believe," Holmes answered, "that where Rochefort is found, the safety of England may be imperilled. Our task is no longer the rescue of one man. It is the defence of many." The words chilled me more than the sea wind that blew across the quay. As we moved along the harbour wall, I could not help but reflect upon the strange and perilous undercurrents that ran beneath the surface of Europe. Nations smiled at one another across their treaties, yet in the darkened alleys of cities and in the shadows of ports like this, men played out a quieter, more insidious game. It was a sobering thought that a single name, spoken almost in passing, might carry with it the destinies of governments. I recalled Miss Denham's pallid face, her whispered fear of foreign eyes, and I felt anew the cruel reach of those unseen rivalries. It seemed to me that Alfred Pemberton was but one more pawn upon a board too vast for human sympathy. Holmes, reading my thoughts with that uncanny intuition of his, remarked softly, "We stand upon the shore of greater tides, Watson. A man may be swept away in silence, and yet the waves will reach Parliament and Crown." Holmes halted abruptly, his gaze sweeping the narrow streets that led away from the harbour. "He has not left Dover," said he with quiet certainty. "Men of Rochefort's stamp do not flee until the work is done. He is here, concealed among the lodging-houses, waiting his moment." I asked what course he proposed. "We shall search, Watson, with eyes open but tongues closed. The inns by the sea will harbour more than sailors. One of them conceals the hand that has reached from France to strike upon English soil." There was no theatrical flourish in his manner, only the calm assurance of one who had measured his adversary's method and foresaw the ground upon which the next move must be made. As we turned into the narrow lanes, I felt the gravity of the hunt press upon me. Somewhere close at hand, hidden behind drawn curtains and bolted doors, lurked the shadowy figure whose name already echoed like thunder in my mind, Rochefort. The evening had deepened into a grey twilight, when Holmes led me through the winding lanes that skirted Dover's harbour. The sea spray clung to the damp air, and the salt wind carried with it the muffled clang of rigging against the masts. Narrow alleys opened suddenly into small squares, then closed again like the passages of a labyrinth, their stones glistening with moisture. Holmes strode beside me with measured calm, his sharp gaze taking in every signboard and curtained window, yet never betraying haste. It was clear to me that his mind, like a compass needle, was already fixed upon the quarry. He had spoken little since the harbour, but there was a controlled intensity about his manner, which told me that every step was deliberate. More than once I found myself glancing uneasily over my shoulder, for the shadows seemed peopled with lurking shapes. But Holmes pressed forward with quiet certainty, scanning each inn with the cold eye of one who knows that the adversary he seeks is near at hand. At length, Holmes paused before a modest inn, whose windows, though curtained, showed the faint gleam of lamplight. He entered without ceremony, and I followed into a low-ceilinged parlour smelling of tobacco and sea air. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set landlord, whose broad face betrayed unease at our arrival. Holmes addressed him with disarming politeness. "We are seeking a friend who may have lodged here. Perhaps you can assist us." The man hesitated, shifting upon his feet. "We have many lodgers, sir, sailors mostly, who come and go with the tide. Yet one, I think, does not come and go so readily," Holmes remarked softly. His eyes fixed the landlord with such piercing directness that the fellow's composure faltered. "Well," he admitted at last, "there is one gentleman, foreign, I take it, who arrived 2 nights ago. Keeps his room, pays in advance, and asks no questions. He told me he required privacy, and I've been glad enough to oblige." Holmes requested to see the chamber, and after a moment's reluctant nod, the landlord led us up a narrow staircase to a door at the end of the passage. With a furtive glance behind him, he unlocked it and stood aside. The room was small, but its character at once proclaimed secrecy. The curtains were drawn tightly across the windows, shutting out the last of the evening light. Upon the table lay an inkwell, open and half spilled, its acrid scent mingling with the stale air. A sheet of blotting paper bore indistinct smudges, as though words had been hastily effaced. Holmes crossed the floor silently, his eyes sweeping the chamber with minute attention. He touched the curtain fabric, examined the desk, and paused for an instant at the hearth where a trace of burnt paper lay in the grate. "It is a room of concealment, Watson," he murmured, "not of rest." At that moment, a sound from the stair below warned us that we were no longer alone. The door opened abruptly, and a tall man entered, halting upon the threshold as his gaze fell upon us. His features were sharp and strongly marked, his dark eyes gleaming with sudden suspicion. For an instant, the room seemed charged with silent hostility. "Gentlemen," he said at length, his accent betraying the cadence of the continent, "you honour my poor quarters. May I ask to what I owe this intrusion?" Holmes advanced a step, his manner affable to the point of indifference. "A mistake, sir," he replied easily. "We were directed here in search of an acquaintance. It seems we have trespassed upon your privacy." The man inclined his head stiffly, but his eyes never left us. They darted from Holmes's face to mine, then back again, as though measuring what manner of visitors had so unexpectedly appeared. His hand tightened momentarily upon the knob of his walking stick, and I fancied that beneath his courtesy there lurked a restless watchfulness, the tension of one who lives in perilous expectation. Holmes, with that consummate ease which so often concealed his deepest scrutiny, assumed the air of a weary traveller at last released from his journey. He spoke lightly of the town, of its inns and lodgings, and of the difficulty of finding quarters at so late an hour. His tone suggested nothing beyond idle conversation, yet his eyes, hooded and serene, missed no detail of the stranger's bearing. "I trust you have found this house to your liking?" Holmes inquired, as though the matter were one of no consequence. The man smiled faintly. "It serves," he answered, though his voice lacked warmth. Holmes continued with unflagging geniality, remarking upon the sea wind, the crowds upon the quay, the price of fish at market. To the casual ear, it was prattle, but I recognized in it the subtle probing of a master. Our host responded with short phrases, each word weighed, his reserve betraying more than candor might have done. It was a duel of courtesy, yet behind it I felt the clash of keener weapons. As the conversation drifted, my attention was caught by the direction of Holmes's gaze. He appeared wholly at ease, leaning upon the mantel, yet I noticed that his eyes rested constantly upon the stranger's hands. Following his glance, I perceived what had attracted him. The man's fingers, long and sinewy, were stained with black ink, the marks ground deep into the skin, as though from long and recent labour. The nails bore the faint impressions of pressure, and the knuckles were reddened with strain. These were not the hands of an idle lodger. They were the hands of one who had written furiously, perhaps copied or forged, with no time for care. Holmes, ever courteous, made no remark, but I saw the faint gleam in his eyes that betrayed recognition. For my part, the discovery struck me with a sudden chill, for it suggested not only secrecy, but the manufacture of falsehood, documents written to deceive and perhaps to imperil more than one life. I felt instinctively that we stood upon the edge of grave disclosure. The stranger, as though aware of our scrutiny, straightened suddenly and addressed Holmes with a touch of challenge in his voice. "You are not travellers merely, sir. May I ask again, what business brings you to my chamber?" Holmes met his gaze with perfect composure. "Only curiosity, sir," he said, smiling faintly. "But you are correct. Curiosity is seldom innocent. It is often the mask of knowledge." For an instant, the two men regarded one another in silence, each as if to measure the strength of the other. Then, with a bow that was more of dismissal than courtesy, the stranger said, "I must ask you to excuse me. I have work that will not wait." He stepped past us with controlled composure, though I fancied I caught the quickened breath of one who restrains impatience. The door closed behind him with a firmness that left no doubt of his wish to end the encounter. Holmes remained motionless for a few moments after the man's departure, his eyes fixed upon the door. At last he turned to me, his voice low but charged with certainty. "You observed his hands, Watson?" "I did," I replied. "They were black with ink." "Precisely. And not the ink of idle correspondence, but of forged documents, drafts hurried, destroyed, and written anew. It is the stain of labour done in secrecy, where time presses and discovery would be ruin. Our adversary is engaged upon forgery, and forgery upon a scale that touches the state itself." He drew the curtain aside and glanced into the street below. He grows desperate, yet his caution remains. Such men are dangerous, for they strike only when the hour is ripe. We must tread carefully, for we stand upon treacherous ground. I felt a chill of apprehension, knowing well that Holmes's calm words often heralded storms whose violence was yet to break. The sun had sunk behind the cliffs, leaving Dover's harbour wrapped in the dim pallor of twilight. Warehouses, gaunt and weather-stained, stood in sombre ranks along the quay, their darkened windows staring blankly upon the restless sea. The salt wind blew sharply from the channel, carrying with it the cries of gulls and the creak of ships at anchor. I could not suppress a shiver, for the whole scene seemed charged with menace. There was no bustle of trade now, only the stillness of waiting, broken at intervals by the hollow echo of footsteps in some distant alley. The warehouses themselves loomed like sentinels, guarding secrets too perilous for the light of day. Beside me, Holmes walked in silence, his gaze ranging over the deserted yards with the calm assurance of one who reads the ground as another man might read a book. I felt that his keen eyes pierced the gathering gloom to detect patterns and purposes invisible to all others. Holmes halted at length before a warehouse whose boarded windows and padlocked doors bespoke long disuse. The yard before it was strewn with crates and coils of rope, while the shadows deepened swiftly as night came on. "This is the place, Watson," said he in a low tone. "Here the exchange will be attempted. The choice is not accidental. A deserted building, close to the water, with ready means of escape by land or sea. It suits our adversaries perfectly." I glanced about nervously. "And what part shall we play?" "We shall be the unseen audience to their drama," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "Patience and silence are our allies. When the curtain rises, we shall know whether treachery is indeed the theme." There was no theatrical flourish in his words, only the quiet conviction of one who has measured his enemy's design and prepared to meet it. We concealed ourselves among the piled crates, the wood rough and damp beneath our hands, while the chill of the night crept steadily in. The harbour lay hushed save for the faint lapping of water against the quay and the distant clang of rigging in the wind. Time dragged heavily, each minute stretched into an eternity by suspense. Holmes crouched motionless beside me, his figure scarcely distinguishable from the darkness. I marvelled, as I had often done, at the patience of his temperament. While my nerves tingled with suppressed excitement, he seemed as calm as though seated before his own hearth at Baker Street. Once or twice he raised his head, listening intently, and I thought I caught the faintest sound of approaching footsteps. Yet each time the silence closed in again, more oppressive for its brevity. It was in such moments that I realized the peculiar strain of his work, the waiting, the uncertainty, the constant expectation of danger. At last, a faint glow appeared at the far end of the yard. It wavered uncertainly, then grew steadier as a figure advanced, carrying a small lantern shielded by his hand. He moved with caution, pausing now and then to glance about, as though fearful of pursuit. Scarcely had he reached the centre of the yard when a second light flickered in answer. Another figure emerged from the shadows of the warehouse, his steps firm and purposeful. The two approached one another slowly, their lanterns casting long, grotesque shapes upon the ground. I felt Holmes's hand tighten briefly upon my sleeve, a signal for silence. My heart beat faster as I realized that the meeting we had waited for was at hand. The stillness of the night seemed to deepen, broken only by the low murmur of voices as the two men drew close enough to speak. The words were spoken softly, scarcely more than a whisper, yet in the hush of the yard they reached us faintly. Holmes, straining forward, caught fragments that I could not wholly discern. "There will be no suspicion. The courier trusts you. The papers are ready." Then came a reply, deeper and more guarded. "But the risk, if discovered—" A harsh laugh cut him short. "The risk is yours as much as mine. Remember your debts. Remember what you owe." I started at the tone. It was not the accent of a foreign agent alone. There was an intonation unmistakably English, tinged with bitterness. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line, and I knew that he too had marked the implication. The conversation continued in that low, urgent murmur, every syllable hinting not merely of espionage, but of betrayal. It was the voice of treachery striking from within, a revelation that sent a cold weight of foreboding through me. Even as we listened, the murmur of voices broke into sharper tones. One of the men protested angrily, the other retorted with sudden violence. Then, in an instant, the scene was transformed. The lantern swung wildly as a hand struck it, casting monstrous shadows against the warehouse walls. The figures grappled, their outlines twisting grotesquely in the unsteady light. A cry rang out, half rage, half fear, and the sound of a blow followed. Holmes sprang to his feet beside me, but still he waited, his keen eyes fixed upon the struggle. It was a spectacle both terrible and fascinating, the clash of two wills, the silence of the night shattered by the sounds of desperate conflict. The lantern, shaken from its bearer's hand, rolled upon the ground, its light flaring and dimming, as though it too shared the violence of the struggle. For an instant, one figure seemed to prevail, forcing the other back against the crates. Yet the contest was not ended, for both fought with the ferocity of men who know that discovery means ruin. At that critical moment, Holmes leapt forward with the swiftness of a striking hawk, He seized one of the combatants by the collar and wrenched him backward with irresistible force. The man uttered a cry of rage, but Holmes's grasp held firm. "Watson!" he called sharply. I needed no further bidding. Rushing to his side, I flung myself upon the second man, grappling with him as he strove to break free. The struggle was brief but violent. He twisted and writhed like a creature at bay, but the memory of my military service lent me strength, and at last I bore him down against the ground. Holmes, with equal mastery, held his captive immovable. "Quiet now," he said coldly. "You will find resistance unprofitable." Thus, in the space of a few moments, the secret midnight meeting was transformed into capture, our ambush executed with the precision of a plan long laid. The lantern, still burning fitfully upon the ground, cast its glow across the features of the man beneath my grasp. I started back in utter astonishment. It was a face known to me. Not a foreign agent, but an Englishman of repute, one whose name had never before been breathed in connection with dishonor. For an instant, I could scarcely credit my senses. The eyes that glared up at me were not those of a stranger, but of a trusted acquaintance, a man whose connection to Alfred Pemberton made his presence here doubly shocking. I looked across at Holmes, who met my gaze with calm intensity. His prisoner, the taller figure with the foreign bearing, was Rashford himself, the sinister agent whose shadow we had pursued from London to the sea. But it was the identity of my own captive that filled me with dismay. "Treachery, Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying both certainty and sorrow. "Treachery where loyalty should have been strongest." And in that moment, I understood that the case had reached its darkest revelation. With the aid of a watchman summoned by Holmes, we conveyed our prisoners into a dim storeroom adjoining the deserted warehouse. The place reeked of damp rope and tar, its bare walls throwing back the hard glow of the lantern we had seized from the ground. The shifting light carved deep shadows across the faces of our captives, lending them a grotesque aspect that suited the grimness of the hour. Holmes moved with quiet authority, fastening the door behind us and placing the lantern upon a crate so that its beam fell mercilessly upon the two men. Rashford, though I did not yet know his name, stood tall and unflinching, his arms folded with disdainful calm. By contrast, the other prisoner sat hunched upon a barrel, his hands trembling as though with a palsy of the soul. It was a moment of singular tension, for though the struggle was past, the air seemed to vibrate still with the violence of it, and I knew that the revelations to come would cut deeper than any physical blow. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze fixed upon the taller man. The lantern's glow fell full upon the stranger's features, keen, aquiline, and marred by a smile that spoke of cold amusement rather than alarm. "Gentlemen," he said in a voice smooth and deliberate, "you have the honor of detaining one who has stood in councils where kings themselves are pawns. Rashford at your service." He inclined his head with mocking courtesy. The name struck me like a thunderbolt. Even I, with but a soldier's knowledge of diplomacy, had heard whispers of that sinister figure, a man whose intrigues had unsettled cabinets and whose hand was said to stretch across Europe unseen. That he should stand before us, a captive in the bleak confines of a Dover warehouse, seemed scarcely credible. Holmes's expression altered not a whit. "Your candour, sir, spares me the trouble of introduction," said he evenly, "but it does little to mitigate your offence." Rashford's cold smile only deepened. If the revelation of Rashford's identity astounded me, what followed shook me to my very core. The second prisoner lifted his head, and the lantern revealed features pale and drawn with shame. I uttered an involuntary exclamation. It was Mr. Edward Pemberton, the uncle of Alfred, the missing courier, a man I had met on more than one occasion in society, known for his affability and respected for his position. That he should be discovered here, in league with a foreign agent, seemed too monstrous for belief. His hands trembled visibly as he tried to meet Holmes's steady gaze. "This is a mistake," he faltered. But the words failed him, and he buried his face in his hands. The contrast between Rochefort's arrogant composure and the uncle's abject collapse could not have been more stark. Holmes regarded him, without pity. "Your guilt proclaims itself more eloquently than any denial," he said. "But we shall have the facts from your own lips soon enough." Holmes spoke then with the calm precision of a judge delivering sentence. "The pattern is clear. Mr. Edward Pemberton, overwhelmed by debts of which society knew nothing, sought salvation in betrayal. Rochefort, ever alert to weakness, extended his hand. Together, you contrived the disappearance of the courier. You staged a struggle, removed him by stealth, and prepared to deliver his dispatches into foreign hands." The accused groaned, pressing his trembling hands together as if to ward off the relentless logic. Rochefort stood silent, his smile unaltered, as though the exposure of the scheme were but another move in a game already calculated. Holmes continued, his tone unyielding. "You reckoned without the vigilance of the state, and without the loyalty of a man who, though silent in his duty, was watched by eyes sharper than you dreamed." The uncle muttered broken words of protest, but his quivering frame and downcast eyes betrayed the futility of denial. At Holmes's command, we searched the adjoining rooms of the warehouse. In a corner chamber, dimly lit and rank with the odour of chemicals, we found Alfred Pemberton. He lay stretched upon a pallet, his features pale, his breathing slow and heavy. At first I feared the worst, but a closer examination revealed that his condition was not death, but deep stupor. "A narcotic," said Holmes, bending to sniff the air. "Laudanum, administered to ensure compliance." I noted the courier's clenched hands, as though he had struggled even against unconsciousness. A sealed leather pouch lay beside him, its strap cut, its contents evidently rifled. Holmes replaced it with delicate care. "Alive, though enfeebled," I murmured, my heart stirred with relief. "Alive, and therefore testimony may yet be had," Holmes returned gravely. "But the injury done to his honour and his mission may prove more lasting than that inflicted upon his body." We bore the young man into the main chamber, where his uncle shrank visibly at the sight. The confrontation between nephew and uncle, though one lay insensible, was too much for the elder man. He broke at last beneath the weight of Holmes's unspoken accusation. "Yes," he cried, his voice hoarse with despair. "It is true. I was ruined. Debts pressed me on every side. Rochefort promised gold, deliverance, freedom from disgrace. I yielded. I betrayed my trust, my blood, my honour." The words poured from him in a torrent, each syllable dragging him deeper into shame. His hands shook as he wrung them together, his eyes wild with the anguish of exposure. Holmes watched with cold detachment, his face unreadable. "You sought to sell what was not yours to sell," he said quietly. "The honour of your country cannot be pawned to redeem a gambler's debts." At that, Edward Pemberton sank back into silence, broken and trembling, his confession wrung from him not by threat, but by the inexorable logic of his own guilt. All eyes turned then to Rochefort, who stood as immovable as stone. He had listened to the confession with a faint curl of contempt upon his lips, but he himself remained mute. Holmes addressed him directly. "And you, sir, have you nothing to add?" The Frenchman's smile hardened, but he spoke no word. His silence was more eloquent than denial, for it proclaimed both guilt and defiance. There was in his bearing a strange majesty, as of one who holds secrets too weighty for disclosure. He seemed less a captive than a strategist biding his time, already calculating how the game might be renewed elsewhere. I confess I felt a chill in his presence, for his stillness carried more menace than the uncle's frantic collapse. Here was an enemy who played not for coin or survival, but for power itself, and who reckoned human life as nothing in the balance. Holmes regarded him with the same austere calm, neither taunted nor troubled by the silence. As the lantern light flickered over captor and captive alike, my thoughts turned to the cruel paradox before us. Loyalty, when divided, had wrought destruction more cruel than malice. Here was a man undone not by hatred of his country, but by weakness before temptation. Another who cloaked ambition beneath patriotism, sowing betrayal as a farmer scatters seed. Between them lay Alfred Pemberton, loyal yet stricken, whose trust in both family and state had been turned against him. I could not but reflect upon the fragility of honour, how easily it bends beneath the weight of circumstance. For every Rochefort who plots deliberately, there are 100 Pembertons who falter through debt, desire, or despair. Holmes, standing beside me, broke my reverie with his cold observation. It is not the malice of enemies that most endangers a nation, Watson. It is the frailty of its friends. His words, austere and sorrowful, seemed to hang in the damp air, leaving me with the uneasy sense that the case, though outwardly resolved, had revealed a darker truth still unresolved within the hearts of men. It was with a sense of weary relief that we found ourselves once more within the familiar precincts of Baker Street. The night journey from Dover had passed in silence, broken only by the rattle of the train and the occasional cry of a station porter. My mind was filled with the images of that dark adventure, the harbour shadows, the pale face of Alfred Pemberton, the mocking smile of Rochefort. The contrast between the turmoil so lately endured and the quiet haven of our sitting room was almost startling. Mrs. Hudson, who met us with subdued solicitude, seemed scarcely to believe that within those walls men had returned from scenes where honour and life alike had trembled on the balance. The lamp glowed softly upon the well-known litter of Holmes's experiments, the heap of newspapers, the violin in its corner. Yet beneath that domestic tranquillity, I felt the lingering echo of conflict. Our homecoming was not one of triumph, but of sombre reflection. Holmes cast aside his travelling coat and threw himself into his accustomed chair by the fire. He reached for his pipe, filling it with mechanical precision, and soon the thin spirals of smoke ascended into the dim light of the lamp. For long minutes he spoke not a word. His gaze was fixed upon the flames, his features calm yet drawn, as though the weight of the case pressed still upon his spirit. I had grown used to his silences, but this one carried with it a peculiar gravity. It seemed to me that he was not so much resting as grappling with thoughts too deep for utterance. The shadow of Rochefort's defiance and Edward Pemberton's confession hung over him still. I refrained from intrusion, content to watch in sympathy, though my own heart longed for the relief of speech. The stillness deepened, broken only by the occasional crack of coal upon the hearth. At last, unable to restrain my curiosity, I ventured to ask him to review the chain of events. Holmes, without turning his gaze from the fire, complied with a calmness that bespoke not pride, but weariness. The courier entered the train bearing his dispatches. At some point between London and Dover, Rochefort and his accomplice forced entry. A struggle ensued, leaving the signs we observed, the scuffed seat, the broken strap, the foreign button. Pemberton was drugged and conveyed secretly from the carriage. His uncle, under cover of family loyalty, provided the means of access and concealment. The warehouse served their purpose until the appointed exchange. There the scheme collapsed. His voice was measured, each word delivered with clarity, yet without the note of satisfaction which usually accompanied the unravelling of a mystery. When he had finished, he relit his pipe and fell into silence once more, as though the recital had given him no more pleasure than the reading of a mournful epitaph. After a long pause, Holmes turned to me, his expression grave. "There is a lesson in this, Watson, and one not easily borne. When loyalty is divided, when the bonds of blood draw one way and the claims of honour another, the result is often as cruel as deliberate malice. Edward Pemberton did not hate his nephew, nor did he despise his country. Yet his debts, his weakness, his divided heart, these drove him to betray both. In such conflicts, men commit acts from which their nature might otherwise recoil." He drew upon his pipe, the glow lighting his austere features, I have seen much of crime, but I confess that those born of weakness rather than hatred disturb me most. They reveal how fragile is the fabric upon which duty rests, and how easily it may be torn by the weight of circumstance. His words carried the quiet authority of truth, and I could find no answer save silence. My thoughts turned, inevitably, to Miss Clara Denham. I pictured her pale face, her eyes dark with grief, her trembling hands clinging to the hope of Alfred's safety. For her, the tragedy was not of treaties broken or secrets sold, but of the quiet heartbreak inflicted by deception. The shadow of betrayal had fallen not upon governments alone, but upon a woman's love. I reflected too upon Alfred Pemberton, whose loyalty had brought him into peril not only from without, but from within his own kin. Though he survived, the wound to his trust must remain long after the laudanum's effect had passed. How cruel it seemed that devotion to one's country should exact such a toll from those least prepared to bear it. In that moment, I felt with renewed force the truth that the affairs of state, cloaked in dignity and secrecy, are borne upon the silent sufferings of private hearts. The ledger of diplomacy is balanced not only with ink, but with tears. Holmes, perceiving my mood with his usual quickness, regarded me with a faint, almost pitying smile. "You are moved, my dear Watson, as is natural. Yet sentiment, though noble, is a treacherous guide. One must learn to look upon such matters with detachment. Otherwise, the heart clouds the eye, and justice falters." There was no cruelty in his words, only the austere conviction of one who had schooled himself against emotion. Still, I could not wholly reconcile myself to his position. It seemed to me that compassion, far from obscuring truth, lent it colour and meaning. Holmes leaned back, his pipe between his fingers, his eyes distant. "We serve best when we stand apart," he continued. "It is not for us to comfort or condemn, but only to observe and to act." His tone was calm, but I fancied I detected beneath it a shadow of weariness, a loneliness born not of failure, but of perpetual detachment. The silence stretched again, and when Holmes next spoke, it was with that quiet irony which so often veiled his deepest reflections. "The newspapers will speak of a vanished courier, a foreign spy, and the vigilance of the authorities. Yet the true mystery, Watson, lay not in disappearance or intrigue, but in the frailty of human loyalties. A man's debts, his pride, his fear, these proved more potent than any stratagem of Rochefort. Remove the uncle's weakness, and Rochefort is powerless. With it, he nearly triumphed." He allowed the smoke of his pipe to curl upward in delicate spirals. "Men will ask how a courier could vanish from a locked carriage. Few will ask how honour could vanish from a loyal heart, and yet it is the latter question that bears the darker answer." I could not but marvel at his insight, though his words left me with a weight of sadness rather than satisfaction. The fire had sunk low upon the hearth, casting long shadows across the familiar room. Holmes sat silhouetted against the glow, his figure sharp yet strangely remote, as though already receding into memory. The air was thick, with smoke, the scent of tobacco mingling with the faint odour of chemicals that lingered from his experiments. I watched him in silence, reflecting how often I had seen him thus, solitary and austere, bearing the triumph of intellect and the burden of isolation alike. The case was ended, yet its echoes would linger long, in the grief of Clara Denham, in the dishonour of Edward Pemberton, in the silent menace of Rochefort's escape into the shadows of Europe. As I extinguished the lamp, the last glow of the fire flickered upon Holmes's unmoved features. Thus the adventure of the Dover train slipped into the past, another page in the annals of my friend's strange and formidable career, and one that left behind more sorrow than triumph. Holmes sat back in his chair, the fading glow of the fire casting his features into sharp relief. "You see, Watson," he murmured. "It was not the foreign hand that proved most dangerous, but the trembling one that should have been most steadfast. Loyalty divided between blood and duty is a frailty that breeds betrayals more cruel than malice. I remained silent, pondering the truth of his words, until he added, with quiet irony, "It is never the enemy we expect who unravels us, but the friend we trust." And now, I turn the question to you. What do you think was the uncle's greatest mistake? His debt, his silence, or his final act of betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this mystery stirred your imagination, I invite you to subscribe for more tales of Holmes's deductions, and share the story with friends who enjoy a puzzle in the shadows.